Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Navigating Hard Conversations panel. My name is Aaron. I was a head of people and a head of communications at Square for a very long time before now. I have a small communications consulting firm. So communications is a big part of what I do on a day-to-day basis, but not as much, obviously, as our panelists today. I figured I would start by offering everybody an opportunity to introduce themselves and tell our audience a little bit about what they do. I will go around the circle in my little Zoom, so you don't have to all jump all over each other. Why don't we start with you, Anika?
Thank you so much, Aaron. As mentioned, my name is Anika Gupta, and I've encountered online communities via a very interesting path. I started my career as a journalist, which brought me into the world of what we then were calling user-generated content, and I actually started working with and moderating several news-related online communities, and then eventually moved into a role where I was a product manager for several of them. And so I've kind of seen online communities both from the perspective of somebody trying to create conversation, but then also somebody building technology platforms where people can interact. And perhaps most relevantly and interestingly for this conversation, a couple of years ago, I wrote a book called How to Handle a Crowd, which was published by Simon & Schuster. And that drew on some of the independent research I'd done, where I basically spent a year interviewing moderators of online communities from all different corners of the internet. So the book has, people who run World of Warcraft guilds, people who moderate popular subreddits, and all other kinds of niche communities. It was just a really fascinating introduction to how different people handle difficult conversations and what a difficult conversation means for them. So really excited to talk about this more.
So next up in my little circle is Colina. Hi, Colina.
Hi, Aaron. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Colina Cole, and I'm the president and founder of Communications Eliminating Conflict. I am a trained mediator, negotiator, facilitator. So all of my work is around having difficult conversations, helping people navigate, community issues. I specialize in working with governance and civil societies. I graduated from the University of Massachusetts, Boston with a degree in conflict resolution, and I focused on historical memories, democracy, and just helping societies heal after mass atrocities and conflicts.
Colina, I'm going to put you on the spot immediately by saying I looked at your bio, and it says that you're conversant in Icelandic. And have you ever mediated a debate or disagreement in Icelandic?
No, I have not. Interestingly enough, I went to Iceland. I studied at the University of Iceland, and I earned a diploma in Icelandic as a second language. Wow. And I actually went to Iceland because Iceland is one of the most peaceful countries on this earth, if you look at our Peace and Global Index. And, I wrote my master's thesis on the Hutu-Tutsi conflict, right, in Africa. And so I never thought I would ever go from the motherland to Iceland. But people ask me all the time, why did I go there? But I wanted to look at conflict through a different lens. We are always so focused on sub-Saharan Africa, Middle Eastern countries, and I wanted to know what conflict would look like in a peaceful society.
Awesome. That's amazing. Laura, Reddit, not quite Iceland, but why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background as well?
I do have an Iceland connection, Colina. I will get to that in my bio. My name is Laura. Thank you so much for the introduction and having me here. I am the vice president of community at Reddit. But my claim to fame is having the word community in my job title for, I think, 17 years now. I've been working in community since the early 2000s when I joined Yelp as one of the original community managers. So again, shout out to UGC as a 3-letter acronym we all know and love. At the time, there were under 50 people, and we were really defining the content strategy, policy, governance, and I was responsible in particular for launching Yelp in international markets. So shortly after joining, I moved to Europe, spent the better part of a decade living abroad, moving continent to continent, launching communities, which of course presented some unique challenges, which we can get into later around policy and governance. What is allowed in the US being different than what is allowed, say, in Germany or Singapore or probably Iceland. a lot of team building and frontline work. After Yelp, I joined Duolingo for 5 years. And this is my Icelandic connection. It was actually, after Finnish, the #1 language that was requested for us to build at Duolingo. So Colina, hit me up after this. We can put you on the Icelandic team building team. Because what a lot of people don't know is that Duolingo courses for a long period of time were built and maintained by teams of volunteers. So when we're talking about governance and actually creating community at scale, online forums, these types of things, Duolingo is really at the forefront of allowing language-based conversation and in-person language events. And yes, now I'm at Reddit, which I'm sure we all know and love. I oversee both the community discipline, which is a multifunctional team, programs, data, marketing, growth, policy, all these things. But also it's Reddit's purpose. The product is community. And so I have a dual role of acting as the discipline leader, but also as the steward for the value of community. And it's something I'm extremely passionate about. So it's a privilege to be here to talk to you about it today.
Well, it's great to be in a room full of UGC people. I spent my early career at YouTube in 2007, 2008, 2009 with the explosion of UGC. And so I'm pleased to have put that past behind me, and I'm excited that you all have to work on it. So I guess, Laura, I would love to start with you. You've made a career working in online communities. You joked about its pervasiveness in your job title for almost 20 years now. And I think famously at Reddit, people think about community being both a positive experience on a platform, but can also be, very difficult to participate in, but also to moderate. And so I'm curious if you can help us understand how you think about the differences between difficult or bad behavior in a community. Not all difficult community behavior is purely bad or abuse, but that doesn't mean it's always healthy, but that doesn't mean that you should shut it down. I'm curious what you look for in making the determination about categorizing different kinds of difficult or bad behavior.
Sure. Yeah, I do love the nuance you pointed out there, because I think it's important that we clarify that, not all conflict is a bug, right? Not all conflict is a bug in communities, and it actually can be very important as a glue for bonding and creating belonging amongst diverse ideas, and it allows for accessibility. But to your point, abuse is never accepted. It's never acceptable, and sometimes it's very easy to spot abuse, right? I'm sure that's not what we're talking about today. Sometimes you see content and it requires very little or no context at all to determine that it's bad behavior. Direct abuse, threats, slurs, manipulation, brigading, policy violating content. I could go on and on, right? It's not a nice list to look at. But more often than not, it's not that simple. Because first, one size fits no one. People's needs are as diverse as they are. And that includes their safety needs. That includes how they feel when communicating. And so outside of the clear lines in the sand I mentioned above, everyone really has their own comfort level and lived experience of relating to one another. You're dealing with thousands of people with different variations of context, and intentions may be innocent, but the impact may not be. And that's, I think, an important distinction, which really clarifies my thinking on how to address it. The other thing I want to point out is that the opposite happens as well, where someone complies with the rules by the letter, but not by the spirit. It's probably the quality I like least in people. At Reddit, we call it malicious compliance, where people do this online and in real life by deliberately antagonizing, but they're not breaking an official rule, right? So to answer your question more directly, I look at two things in particular. First, I focus on impact rather than evaluating intent. Rather than attempting to make a judgment call generally, to determine whether someone's acting in good faith or in bad faith, which are, judgmental by nature, I shift the focus to become more outcomes driven. Did the conversation take place as discourse, even if it was spirited discourse, or did it incite targeted harassment or direct abuse? Again, I'll point out that intent and impact are two different things. And so I just don't focus on intent. I focus on impact. The second thing is I focus on patterns of behavior, not on individual content. So a content first approach to moderating bad behavior is like playing whack-a-mole, right? Reflecting back for me on the more challenging situations I've faced, they've not generally centered around inherently harmful content, but around toxic behaviors that generally you can spot in patterns. So I don't know. I think that the best learning I have from all of this and from my experience in the industry is that I do not spend time on people who do not want to be a part of my platform. That is not energy well spent. I am more than happy to spend time on people who might be in a difficult position or might be navigating a very complex or challenging or nuanced topic, and they're willing to work with me or with my team. But many times the response to the outreach is all you need to know, because they'll tell you right away if they want to participate and improve or whether they are being maliciously compliant.
It's so interesting to me because the nature of the internet, the nature of social media has always created distance. The early stereotypes of people on the internet were, guys in their mom's basement, on their keyboards, and you could never know who anybody really was. And that sort of was exacerbated by the pandemic. I mean, the four of us we're not together right now. And so I feel like that creates a sort of an easier way for people to interact with others without worrying about sort of the consequences of their actions or the fact that they might have a different reaction, or they might just, slam if we're talking about Twitter, slam the retweet button and just dunk on somebody just because there's no connection between people. I'm curious how you can encourage, I guess, Anika, I'll ask you this question. How do you encourage people to take a moment before immediately getting into a thread and firing away this response that you're having right now, and encourage people to maybe take a breath and just be more thoughtful, which is going to have, potentially a much more positive impact than just hitting a button immediately?
I think that's a really interesting question, Iron. And I think I saw when I was doing this and when I was interviewing other people about how they do, that there are a couple of different levels on which that can operate. I think one of the things that the moderator told me when I was interviewed that really stuck with me is she was very aware of not just her own emotional responses to situations, but also the behaviors that characterized those. And here's what I mean. One of the things she said to me is I began to notice that if I were typing really fast, that was a sign that I was really emotionally activated. And I think a lot of times, many of us don't always pay that kind of close attention to our own cues, right? So I think as a moderator, kind of being aware of those behaviors and then looking for them in your community, right? So like if you start getting a lot of notifications that people are really going back and forth, you're like, they may not be listening. Because that's a sign that discussions are going in a negative direction. So I think the first is recognizing behaviors and patterns and having ways to have that surface to you when these kinds of conversations are happening for thought. But then the second part of your question, of course, is then how do we intervene and try to encourage that thoughtfulness? And I think there are a couple of interesting ways, right? And it really, this is where kind of the affordances of platforms come into play. So, for example, I talked to moderators who would, when they noticed a discussion was becoming controversial, they would take the people who are participating in it and they would pull them into a separate group. They would say, we're closing it here. We're going to take these folks to a private conversation and kind of moderate with just them for a little bit, and then they can come back and tell the group, okay, we're good, or this, someone can apologize, someone else can, own harm, etc. And that was one way to deal with it. Another avenue is to address it at the rules level, where you can say, like, hey, I worked with a group where they implemented this rule that you could basically only post one comment per thread per half hour. And when they first implemented that, people were upset, but then they noticed over time, including some of the moderators, it was not an uncontroversial decision. But what they noticed is that forced people to kind of get out of that emotionally activated and try and listen to what was being said. So that's one way to do it. I think that there are other ways that you can do it at if you are actually designing a platform, you can kind of embody some of these things, right? You can, like, start to notice, you can say, okay, these discussions between players are happening. We're going to silence both of them for a little while. But we're going to make their comments grayed out, and then they have to be actively made to others. So there are ways that you can kind of build that in on a technical level. But those are some of the avenues that I saw.
Colina, so much of the work that you've described that you've done in your career it speaks to the different cultures that underlying conflict. And I mean, the difference between Rwanda and Iceland, to say the least, and how people's expectations and, you know, their humanity affects conversations in different places amongst equal people. I'm curious how you think about, I guess this is a little bit of a liberal artsy question, but how do you think about connecting people with each other's humanity? Like, is there a way across cultures, across differences of opinion, you know, across the Democratic Republican divide, across the street, the community, that you can get people to see that they are just their neighbors?
Well, let me tell you, culture can exacerbate conflict. It really can, because as much as we are humans, we are raised with beliefs. We are, from the moment we are born, we are indoctrinated with, you know, our religious, our family values, and we take that and we go into the world. And although we can connect with people's humanity, sometimes these things can also divide us. And so what we have to keep in mind is that when we're in the midst of those difficult moments, is we have to focus on something that, what are we trying to achieve out of this conversation? What are we trying to build out on this relationship? What are the things that are going to move us forward? And in that, you really do have to just look for the things that bring you together versus the things that divide you. And so that is part of working with going across cultures, because it is challenging. There are a lot of things that can be, you know, when we encounter differences, is that when we encounter difference in other cultures, it can bring up resistance, and it can also reinforce that which we were raised with. But you have to have a certain level of awareness and willingness and openness to look at the other person and hear where they're coming from and where they're saying. And at that level, you really have to just focus on who the person is, because across culture, it doesn't matter. We really are all the same at the core.
So now that I asked the high-level academic question, I'll ask the tactical question of you, Colina, which is, what tactics would you suggest to people attempting to navigate conflict resolution online? And are they any different than the way that you would suggest people navigate them in person?
Yes, it is definitely different, because online you can be anyone you want to be. I find that, especially in the era of COVID, when working remotely, when people, you know, left their offices and went to working remotely, in some ways, you can feel like this great difference between, I don't have to, if you're having difficulty with coworkers, or if you're having difficulty in a workplace, you thought, I'm now separate from all those politics, office politics. But office politics can seep in through emails. And when all communication is shut down and all you're doing is IMing people or emailing people, you can still hear tone, or what you believe is tone. You can still hear these things that can evoke emotions within you. And you can decide how you want to craft your email. If you know that nobody's going to be able to see your eye rolls, nobody's going to be able to know that you're angry. I can talk to a friend and say, this is what I wrote. What do you think about it? I can completely change that image of how I would respond in person versus how I would respond in online. But the other challenge with that is if dynamics change and you don't know the person at all, it is so much more challenging to create trust and to build relationships and to build rapport online than it is in person, because people can't see the warmth of your smile. They can't hear the little laughter in the joke that you might be telling. They can't, those things that connect us as human beings is not there for online communication. So you do have to be a lot more aware and think about your response.
So Laura, I have a long history of crisis communications, and I am friends with a couple of ex-communications people from Reddit, and I am fascinated with what I always saw as like the pioneering challenges of online community management at Reddit, which like really was at the forefront of so many discussions early around, you know, moderating conversation online, especially related to conflict and politics. And as a crisis person myself, I've learned to not be stressed out by that. And I can only imagine what it's like to do it at Reddit. And I was curious, when you think about, managing stressful, difficult situations, how do you do it? And like, I won't say persevere, but the people who are watching this, these can be stressful situations. And I'm curious how you have managed in your career to sort of lower the temperature, not just in the conversations you're overseeing, but for yourself.
Yes. I mean, I think that a lot of the tips that have been shared are great. I really identify with, as your pace is increasing, taking a minute to compose yourself. And I don't know who said this, but this idea that you need to learn to listen to understand rather than listen to be understood. That was a lesson I learned early in my career. And it was an in real life lesson I learned. In fact, it was an icebreaker where you were in a room with other people and you give one person a prompt and they have to speak for 2 minutes and the other person has to listen without responding for 2 minutes. And just how hard that is and how much you realize that generally when you're talking, you're already crafting your next response, but that in this icebreaker, you were not, you were just listening, just recognizes that how quickly we can get into the mindset of not really listening to understand, but listen to be understood. Online is different, right? You have these escalating elements, the quick pace interaction, making it personal, discomfort with other people's conflicting opinion, and you have your de-escalating elements, right? You have identifying common ground, willingness to embrace differences, focusing on the issues, not the people. But I think that ultimately, both online and in my personal life, I've realized that my ability to de-escalate depends on the severity of the conflict, but also where the conflict is happening, right? When someone publicly states a position, online or in person, it's much harder for them to change that position later. And of course, text-based discussion is no different. So I think that I recommend to moderators and teams and to myself to get really good at complete and contextualized sentences and to use them. The best place to de-escalate is before we start talking, before the conflict goes public. So if you know something is going to be a conflict or is going to be controversial or spicy or conflict causing, get in front of it. Make a strategy, do a pre-mortem, if you will, and do some pre-communication with known stakeholders to try and de-escalate before it hits a boiling point.
Anika, I mean, you wrote a book on this topic. I'm curious, how much do you think about the overall health of the online community being related to the overall health of the moderators themselves? Do you see any connection there? And how do you translate, from the people trying to oversee this group, in order to make sure that they're not just like moderating, but actually contributing to the health of the community itself? I'm curious how you think about that.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I think many of us would probably agree that like the health of the moderators is essential to the health of the community. Like it's probably one of the most fundamental questions. And so I think there are a couple ways to think about that. The first is that most of the moderation groups that I spoke to, and I interviewed a lot of volunteer moderators. So Laura will know the group very well. And so these are folks who are moderating, for various reasons, obviously, many, because you love the community or, it's a way to meet people, et cetera. But it takes a lot out of you. And so I think I think a healthy community began with a healthy relationship among moderators and people in the moderator group making room for their health. And what that means is having conversations about which topics are difficult for different members of the moderation team who might be activated emotionally by a particular subject. Making space for people who receive training for them to tap out of discussions that proved emotionally challenging, having other people step in, creating spaces where moderators could just blow off steam and joke about some of the really tough parts of the job. Like all of these coping mechanisms and tactics were very much in play for any group that wanted to have like a long-term moderation strategy. A volunteer, I again spoke with volunteers, but I'm pretty sure this would be true for any type of moderation group. So I think that's the first part of it. And then the second part of it really gets at, like, we're talking about difficult conversations. And I think in order to be able to have difficult conversations with your community, you need to be able to have healthy conversations among your moderation group that are difficult as well. And I think that's where a lot of that initial groundwork is laid for how you approach the community, is how do you approach each other? Do you have differences in point of view, differences in approach? How do you navigate that? And creating space for that is really important. And so when moderators can have a healthy and tough conversation among each other, that then enables, I think, and makes it a healthier space for the community to have that in a way that builds up rather than kind of can tear down. And that's not an easy thing to achieve.
In your research, was there any particularly interesting or unique example that jumped out at you as, oh, I hadn't even expected that would be a successful way of doing this, but it stuck with you as different and perhaps useful to others?
I mean, there were a couple that I thought were really interesting. So to give one example, I had one of the groups that I profiled, actually it's a Facebook group, but they are devoted to creating space for people to talk about race. Obviously, one of the top topics of the internet, right? And it's and I don't think every community should take that on. But what I mean is that was their specific focus. And so a lot of the things that they actually had a really extensive training for the moderators as well as for the members. And when you came in, what that meant is that you kind of had to do a lot of introspection around, like, how do you think of your own position in society? You had to do implicit bias tests. You had to, they had a pretty lengthy curriculum, part of which had been developed by some of the moderators, one of whom actually is a pastor. And so that was something she, brought over. She said anti-racism is part of my ministry, and I brought it to this. And so I thought that was a really interesting, they had it for their moderators and they had it for the group members. And that was kind of how they knew if you were sticking with that and contributing to it and doing that in your cohort, then you became a member and you would contribute. And I think that was a really interesting avenue. The other, and this is like a little, it's not quite so high effort to start. I interviewed a moderator who runs a newcomers group on a site for people with like niche dating interests, let's say. And they said that they had a forum just for moderators where they could just go and put the most ridiculous things that people had said to them that day, people crawling into the inbox and being like, you're a fascist for deleting my post. And so, and they could just go there and it was only them and they could talk and make jokes. And it was kind of the water cooler, the digital water cooler for the mod team. I think that was, the person who ran that mod team said it was a great way to blow off steam. So yeah, a couple different approaches that I saw.
I love the idea of fascist moderators in a dating channel. I just think that's awesome.
Well, any topic that brings up our personal identity and personal choices is going to become very difficult for people at every level, and that's why those two examples are actually, I think, tough, but really important.
Yeah, totally. It's really an interesting point. Laura and Colina, I'm curious, the election's coming up, it's a couple weeks away. It's politics in itself is talk about the fascists in the dating channel. Let's talk about like politics. And it just becomes a completely difficult conversation that I can't even imagine how you could steer it towards it being constructive. Anything in your experience, either Colina working, in your cultural research, or Laura obviously having navigated political forums on Reddit for several years. Any thoughts on the folks who are tasked with reviewing political discussions and how to keep the debate lively as you expect while also encouraging civility?
Well, first, let me just say this. Whenever you're trying to have a conversation with groups of people who have opposing views, things are going to come up. There's going to be intense emotions, and there's no way around this. There's no way to, when I say there's no way around this, I mean, it is on the moderator or the facilitator to help move the dialogue, focus the dialogue forward. And so we do a thing in the field what we call reframing, where somebody says something like, oh, you people, and why do you people always do this? The moderator might, will reframe this as, oh, so what I hear you saying is that you don't understand what the other side thinks about, and then the subject, right? This is how we move the conversation forward, because if we allow these groups who have opposing views to focus on this, what they call, we call it you automatically become death dialogue, and we'll never move it forward. So it's really upon the facilitator, the moderator really has an important role in helping that dialogue move forward. And a lot of that is going to center around reframing issues so that we're not highlighting the negative, but focusing on what the other party is actually saying underneath all those intense, heavy words and emotions.
Laura?
I would add that, I mentioned this at the top, but we can't fall into the bad habit of thinking that conflict is a bug, right? It's quite the contrary. It can really contribute to the health of online communities because public disagreement and differences of opinion are major advantages in a lot of ways, and it's certainly in the work of building communities that can establish trust and belonging. Really, we should welcome it, right? The wider variety of opposing opinions we can collect and review, the more resilient and field-tested our decisions. What is important is to identify ground rules and to identify rituals. And I think that Colina pointed many of these out. So identify those for your community. We pointed out a couple, but there's so many more, even rubrics and tools that can help you respond more effectively when disagreeing in a highly visible sphere by de-escalating conflict to a level that doesn't threaten the ability to collaborate. Because once you lose that, you really do lose that element of community and belonging that's so important in the health of healthy discourse.
So I would gladly nerd out on this with all of you for a really long time, but I know that we have a tighter window here. So my last question for you all, and I really do appreciate all your time and your insights today, is if each of you could offer one piece of practical advice or a nugget of a takeaway for the people who are watching today about how to manage difficult conversations in their neighborhoods in order to create, the healthier communities we all aspire to have. What's the one piece of practical advice you would offer? Anika, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I guess I think there are maybe well, you said one, I'm going to potentially do two, but I'm borrowing one from Laura because I really like her point that conflict is not a bug. It is how we grow, right? Challenge is how we grow. We just have to feel healthy about it. And people have different ideas about what conflict is, and it's important to know that. But I think the bit of advice I'd say, building on what I brought up earlier too, is if as a moderator, make sure you're taking care of yourself and you have ways to do that. For yourself and your team, whether that's taking time out, whether that's other people you can turn to and talk to about the work that you're doing, because it's a lot to navigate a hard conversation and carry the weight of all those emotions. Colina, you talked about how much is on the facilitator, and there has to be a healthy outlet for that. So I would say, the number one thing for, if that's your aspiration as a moderator, is just make sure that you have space to take care of your own feelings and what's going to come up for you.
Colina?
Well, what I want to say is I have my master's degree in conflict resolution, and I'm on the road to a PhD where I'm going to be supposedly become an expert. And I say this, right, expert, because I want to tell you that earning a PhD or getting degrees and certifications doesn't make you immune from conflict, right? Conflict is a part of life. As Laura has stated, it's part of the human condition, so it's inevitable. And a healthy neighborhood isn't necessarily a neighborhood that doesn't have conflict. It's whether or not the conflict is destructive or constructive. It's how you approach the conflict. People should know, first and foremost, that conflict invokes a lot of emotions. It's scary. Even though I'm getting my PhD, when I have conflict, I feel intense emotions. So be aware of your own emotions, as Anika has pointed out, and what we do a lot in this field, in the conflict resolution field, is we do a lot of role playing. So if you know that you're going to engage in a difficult conversation, you then have the opportunity to work with somebody else and role play and practice and rehearse what you want to say, how you want to say, and that person can give you feedback, and then you can improve. And then once you're there in the midst of it, you'll be more proactive versus reactive.
Laura?
And I have three. The first, I'm going to become a meme for saying it so often, conflict's not a bug. That's number one, right? Just understanding that controversial and difficult decisions are not inherently bad. The second one, I think, is the first question you asked me, which is identifying the difference between bad behavior and hard conversations. I gave some of my examples. My two were measuring impact rather than intent, and focusing on patterns, not individual content. But identify those for you. Those are mine, right? They may be different for you. So find out what that line is and draw a line in as much as you can. And the third one, I think, is identify lessons for how to constructively engage and model those behaviors in your communities to engage in these controversial discussions. Because back to point one, they're going to happen in a healthy community. They will happen. And by leveraging things like, understanding and respect and empathy, identifying those rules and rituals that we've all called to, and the rubrics and tools that you will use to de-escalate conflict, will again not threaten the ability to collaborate and create healthy discourse.
Well, there's a very bad joke to make here about how this conversation had no conflict in it. So if you'd like, I can just start yelling things at all of you, and then we can fight.
Fascist!
And then, yeah, exactly. I'll just start yelling fascist at people. No, but seriously, I really enjoyed getting to talk with you all. You're all just fascinating, and the insights into this stuff, which is art, not science. Even for the doctor in the house, it is not a thing that has any right answers all the time. And my encouragement to the people who are watching that I've dealt with in my own career on this kind of thing is, you just have to accept that it's okay, and you keep moving forward. And progress is progress, and it's never going to be perfect, and that's okay. And I think, Laura, just to make you the meme, conflict is not a bug. So anyways, I really appreciate all of your time, and thanks for coming.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.